All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Adam Briones, and I'm CEO of California Community Builders. Welcome to CCB's latest and greatest webinar, 2024 Legislative Landscapes Expert Perspectives. For anyone not familiar, CCB is an organization working to close the racial wealth gap using housing and home ownership as our primary tools. And we here at CCB are fond of saying there's really no silver bullet to fix our state's housing and home ownership crisis. But there are some absolutely necessary tools that advocates and communities will need to use if we have any hope of making progress on these important issues. And maybe one of the most important and powerful tools we have, even if it is imperfect and sometimes not as quick as we want, is legislation. And when we think about what has gotten California to a place where it is so hard for a working family to find an affordable place to rent, let alone buy a home, it's often directly related to policy decisions made years, if not decades ago. And because those policy decisions were most often expressed and achieved through legislation, one of the fundamental ways to right the wrongs of the past is to get good bills signed into law today. So while we're here today to talk about the legislative state of affairs in California in 2024, we have a lot of road to cover in terms of other policy issues related to how you actually get good bills passed. And while we try not to brag here at CCB, I do actually want to brag just a little bit. This morning's webinar, we have a really amazing group of experts lined up to talk to you about the state of legislative affairs this year on a few different but related issues. We have Sosan Madanat from W Strategies LLC, who's going to give us a big picture overview of what's going on in Sacramento. We have Esmeralda Lopez from UnidosUS, second appearance in 2 months, translating her organization's national priorities into legislative action here in California. We have Michael Lane, who's representing SPUR, and who's going to be talking about how technical changes, which at times can seem a little boring, can make a huge impact on the issues that we care about. And then we also have my board member, but representing Bar High, Kelsey Lyles, talking about reparations, housing, and the shared goal of racial and economic justice and how we can achieve that through legislative efforts. And then to close us out, we're going to have a very special guest who's going to talk us through a panel Q&A. So before I bring up our first panelist, I just want to say really quickly that we love all of our webinar guests. We have really, really great folks, but this is a special group. And, I just want to say this group not only has a ton of expertise related to public policy and legislation, they're really cool people. Like if this was a conference dinner, this Zoom would basically be the fun table to be at. And so we're super, super excited to have everybody here today. And I'll also share that one of the perks of running a nonprofit, even a small, scrappy nonprofit like California Community Builders, is that you sort of just get to invite people that you like and respect to come to these webinars and talk about their work with you in a formal public way. And that's just like really cool and really fun and a great part of the job. And that's what we've done here today. So without further ado, I would love for producer Savannah to bring Sosan up to the stage. Hey, Sosan, how you doing?
Hi, great. How are you?
Good to see you.
You too.
Before we get into some of the questions we have prepared for you, I'd love to read a quick intro.
Sure.
Sosan, you are a vice president at W Strategies LLC. You're a passionate legislative advocate with over a decade of experience in public policy and state legislation. You're driven by your dedication to service and community and have effectively advocated for clients on an extensive array of issues, including the finance and development of affordable housing, access to affordable healthcare, animal welfare, agriculture and climate-related issues, consumer protections, and economic and social justice. You're a member of the McGeorge School of Law Alumni Board of Directors and the Capital Advisory Committee. And you're on the Citizens Bond Oversight Committee for the Los Rios Community College District. Did I generally cover it correctly?
You got it.
Awesome. So first question for you, and I think it's what's on everybody's minds right now, is as a lobbyist, how close is your work to the television show The House of Cards?
Well, the difference is that that's at the federal level and nowhere near as dramatic, I would say.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to get that one out of the way since everyone's thinking about it. But maybe to kind of kick us off, can you tell us a little bit about W Strategies and the work you do there?
Absolutely. So W Strategies was founded in 2020 by my colleague, Austin Webster. and very good friend. So I'm very, privileged to say that I work with someone I deeply respect and enjoy and actually hang out with on the weekend. So it's great. The organization really started out of the company started out of his passion as well for higher education and a lot of the work that he had previously done. And I joined the team in 2022. It'll be about 2 years coming up here soon in a few months. And I work primarily on housing legislation, although, as you mentioned in my bio, I also do some work in the animal and environmental space and have done work both in the ag space as well as reproductive justice and maternal health care. So, it really runs the gamut as a contract lobbyist. I'm very lucky that I get to work on a number of issues, all of which I'm very passionate about. So every day is different and it's a lot of fun.
That's awesome. And I know that you and I have mostly crossed paths on housing issues. So it's always
Hmm.
really cool to hear about the other work that you do, especially related to animal welfare.
Yeah.
So on the housing point, are there any trends in terms of what you're seeing in the housing space, in housing legislation? You've been at it for over a decade. I know that I met you a couple jobs ago. And so you really have a great sort of big picture view of what's been achieved in housing policy, what remains to be done. So how would you really describe the trends this year from housing advocates and what they're proposing?
Yeah, I think this year is interesting. And a lot of that has to do with where we're at in terms of the state budget, which I'll get into a little bit more shortly. But what I feel like I've seen this year thus far is um, fewer massive transformative bills and more bills that chip away at some issues that we've continued to see create challenges for developers, for potential homeowners or renters. So both from the supply side and the demand side, right? And I would say some of that has come from feedback that we've received from some of our partners in terms of bills that have previously passed that where we still see some gaps. And I would say something, like for example, SB 1123, which is Senator Caballero's homeownership bill. Folks told us that there were still challenges in implementing SB 684 from last year. So we're seeing some cleanup, I would say, or follow up to bills that passed in the streamlining space to increase development. And then other trends I would say right now that I'm seeing are reducing fees for the construction of homes, both rental and home ownership, and then permit streamlining as well, removing some of the barriers to permitting homes and making it faster and easier to build. Those are definitely some of the places where I think I've seen some trends this year as a result of challenges with the budget and because we're in the second year of a 2 year session, which often lends itself to advocates moving maybe smaller but still very important policies. And the other piece I would say, we're still seeing ADU legislation, accessory dwelling unit legislation. That continues to be a very hot issue and one where we're seeing a lot of development successfully, right, throughout the state. So making it easier to build ADUs is another space where I've seen a few bills come up this year.
Okay, absolutely. And actually, if I can, I know we have a lot of folks on the Zoom that are super interested in what's happening in Sacramento, but don't have any
Yeah.
direct personal experience. When you say we're on the second year of a 2 year session and that impacts how
Mhm.
people think about it, could you maybe just go into that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So the California legislature runs in 2 year cycles. Last year was the first year of that cycle, so this year is the second year. And what that means is um, we have a bit of a shorter timeline in the second year of the session. It makes it a little bit harder to run really big bills because the timing is shorter. When folks try to run larger bills, we usually try to introduce them in the first year because it gives us more time to continue to negotiate issues that may arise as the bill moves through the legislative process. And a bill can be held in a committee in that first year and then worked on that next year. And so we have months to maybe negotiate some sticking points. And that's one of the major differences, I would say, when introducing legislation in either the first or the second year.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you for that. So, and I
Yeah,
think you've already brought it up or alluded to it. Obviously, we have a huge budget deficit right now. It's something that the legislature's talked about. It's something the governor's talked about. It's something that
yes.
has impacted, CCB's work. Can you tell us from your perspective, working on a lot of different bills, what are you seeing right now because of the budget? Like, what's the state of play there?
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who aren't as deeply familiar with Sacramento and the way the budget process works, I'll just give a very quick overview. In January, the governor introduces his proposed budget. This year, we saw the governor propose his budget on January 10th. And the expectation, or what the governor had said, was that we were looking at a $38 billion deficit. Despite the fact that the Legislative Analyst Office, which also analyzes where we're at as a state in terms of our fiscal health, projected a $68 billion deficit. So there was definitely a really big gap there in what we were looking at. And then in May, the governor proposes a May revise, and that really takes into account tax filings throughout the state in April. And so it gives the state a better sense of what the fiscal health will be and provides us an opportunity to have a better understanding of where we're at and what the outlook is. Unfortunately, this year in May, the governor did actually project closer to what the Legislative Analyst Office had projected, around 56 billion. And so what that means right now is that we're facing a $56 billion deficit over the next 2 years. And unfortunately, that means a lot of very critical programs that already exist are looking at deferrals, looking at major cuts, um, and and it also limits any new programs from coming forward. And CCB and Unidos obviously experienced this year when we were running AB 2140, and unfortunately the cost of that was too high to continue moving the bill forward. And we saw that happen actually a lot. And so in terms of trends, I would say a number of housing bills that maybe created new programs or tried to add funding to existing programs did not move forward. And right now, they're actually in the heat of negotiations between the legislature and the governor to meet the June 15th deadline of coming to a balanced budget. Um, and so I would say that's been the biggest challenge this year is knowing that we're facing such a significant deficit.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I know you don't actually have a crystal ball, but if you did have a crystal ball, like what would you say is going to be coming up in 2025? I know that folks are already starting to think about next year. Like any guesses on what the big issues might be or what you think folks are going to bring forward?
I think there are a lot of conversations that are happening, and I think this is also going to depend on what we see, one, come out of the budget negotiations, and two, what bills continue to move forward, right? We still have until August 31st to see what survives. Um, but one thing that I think we may see is potentially some more local financing measures similar to, and when I say local, I mean regional, similar to what we saw with the Bay Area Housing Finance Agency and the similar LA La Casa regional financing agency. I anticipate, and I've already actually heard a few conversations around creating additional regional financing agencies because of the challenges that we're seeing at the state level in order to try to protect some of the programs at the local level.
Yeah.
So I expect we may see that. And any ways that locals can generate additional funds for housing may move forward. I would also anticipate we'll see additional streamlining bills. And then home ownership has become part of the conversation in a way that it hasn't before when we talk about housing and the landscape in general. I expect we will see and hear more from folks that are homeownership advocates to try to follow up potentially on, the CCB and Unidos bill this year. Also, condo reform is a big conversation, and I know some of the folks on this call are in those discussions this year, and we saw a few bills that were trying to push that reform forward also get held. And so I anticipate that we'll see those bills come up again or something similar um, next year.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sosan. A, you're
Absolutely.
a great colleague to CCB. B, I
Thank
think
you.
you've given our audience a great overview of kind of what's going on this year in Sacramento. So we're going to bring you back at the end. But next up, producer Savannah, if you could bring on Esmeralda so that we can talk about her work at UnidosUS. Hey, Esmeralda, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. I'm going to read your formal bio so everybody knows who you are. And then we'll get to the questions. But first off, for everybody that didn't join last month's webinar, Esmeralda Lopez is the California State Director of Policy and Advocacy at UnidosUS. Before joining Unidos, Esmeralda spent 9 years in Washington, D.C., where she served as the legal and policy director at the Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum, working to advance workers' rights, combat forced labor, and ensure corporate accountability. She has also worked for the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, the Office of Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, and served on the board of the American Civil Liberties Union of Southern California. Esmeralda earned her JD at Santa Clara University School of Law and bachelor's from Cal State Sacramento. So, Esmeralda, welcome back. You and Unidos have been such wonderful colleagues and friends to us at CCB that we were just like, if anybody's coming twice in 2 months, it's going to be Esmeralda. So maybe the first question I can ask you is, are you tired of us yet? Does CCB bother you too much? Are me and Greg and Sylvia just showing up in your email like way too often?
Not yet. Thank you. I appreciate you all as well.
Okay, absolutely. So in terms of the work you do, and again, for the folks that aren't, religiously joining CCB's webinars, can you tell us a little bit about UnidosUS and the work that you do? And should I go ahead and share your PowerPoint?
Go ahead.
Okay, good. Awesome. Let's see here. And
maybe the next slide. Yeah.
There we go.
So UnidosUS is the nation's largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization, and we've been advancing the rights of Latinos for over 50 years. We have an affiliate network of 300 community-based organizations across the country. And in California specifically, we've had an office in Los Angeles since 1984, and we have an affiliate network that's made up of 69 California-based affiliate organizations that collectively invest more than 1.9 billion and employ more than 17,000 staff here in the state, and also provide services directly to 2.69 million Californians annually. And I would say, next slide, please. I think it's really important for the sake of this conversation. I also wanted to make sure that I highlighted the fact that we have something at the national level that's called the Home Initiative. And that is because we think that home ownership for the Latino community, we know for a fact, has the capacity to transform the economic trajectory of Latinos through, and we want to make sure that we're advancing systemic change through policy so that we can advance policy in other ways as well. I'm focusing on policy, so that's for the sake of this webinar, we're focusing on policy. And we want to make sure that we're creating opportunities by 2030 for 4 million new Latino homeowners. Oh, sorry, Adam. I was gonna, I guess, wait for the next question. I'm done.
Oh, sorry about that. So while we have you, so I think, one of the things that we were really curious about, Esmeralda, is, why, and I'll ask you two in one sentence. So first, why is Unidos a national organization, the largest Latino civil rights organization in the country? Why are you focused on state level legislation? And then two, if you could talk a little bit about the bill that we partnered with you on this year, AB 2140, what it would have done, why you thought it was important, and how it fit into Unidos's larger strategy and goals.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. I think it's a really good one. And I think that, Unidos has for a long time really seen the value in building power in the Latino community and their influence. And one of those ways has to be, we found, to ensure that we're also active in states where a lot of Latinos live, California, of course, being one of them. And strategically, the organization has also been aligning itself to really helping build power and influence. And one of the ways to even do that at the national level is to make sure that we're working at the state level. I would also say that as it relates to California specifically, we really are at the forefront of a lot of policy. We like to look at California to see what are the policies that potentially are working that could be scaled up or applied in other states or even at the national level. And also what are the lessons learned that can also be elevated at the national level. So those are some of the reasons that Unidos as an organization has really invested in state work, even though we are a largely national focused organization. I would also add that as it relates to home ownership, we released a report, which is what this slide is about here, in September, in which we found that there's a lot of opportunity in California for advancing Latino home ownership. The truth is that if we want to reach a goal of 4 million new homeowners in the country, we can't do that without California. And in California, there's almost 4 million, last we checked in this report, Latino households. And we found that 1 out of every 4 mortgage-ready Latinos live in the state of California. So that's why we've also made investments as it relates to this policy. And when you talk about AB 2140, of course, we also found in the report, what I would say is that one of the biggest hurdles was a clear lack of homes that were more affordable for purchase for Latinos. So kind of the idea of more starter homes. And some of the challenges that we have seen is that those homes aren't being built. And one of the reasons that we really thought that this bill, AB 2140, would advance Latino homeownership opportunities was because it would create a way for the government to support or create a framework to create larger scale homeownership financing programs that could really help to fill this gap.
Awesome. And I think, one last question for you before we let you go, Esmeralda, is, really curious. You and I, obviously, and the team here at CCB have spent a lot of time on this particular bill, AB 2140. Unfortunately, it didn't make it out of the Assembly Appropriations Committee, but we think that good ideas are evergreen and look forward to hopefully partnering with you all again on it in future years. But curious, outside of the work that we did this year, what are some other legislative issues that you and your network are really interested in now or in the future?
So one of the other issues here in California that we're really focused on, I think you can go to the next slide. Yeah. Of course, we're going to continue to invest in homeownership. That is very clear. And that is a long-term investment. It's going to be a multi-year investment, as not only at the national level, but of course here in California. So that's going to remain consistent. I would also say that we have been consistently working on advancing the rights, like Latino students, and we do that really through supporting a lot of work K through 12 multilingual learners, but also looking more to explore opportunities for 0 to 3 early education for Latino students as well. Also, critical time, of course, for students, as we know more and more about how the brain works. So those are kind of the two really, I think if I was going to put them in 2 buckets, those would be the 2 big buckets that we're going to be working on. So happy to answer any questions or hear from folks on the call as well.
Oh, that's awesome, Esmeralda. And I think just looking at the time, I think that was probably a great one to wrap your individual session on. But in terms of the work you do and the affiliates that you have around the state, for folks that are interested in your work and want to learn more, where should they go? What's the website?
UnidosUS.org.
Very simple, very straightforward. So awesome. Thank you, Esmeralda. I know you're coming back at the end. Producer Savannah, if you could go ahead and bring up our great colleague, Michael Lane. Hey, Michael, how you doing?
Adam, good morning. Great. Thanks for inviting me.
Good. How's the weather in San Jose?
It's always bright and sunny here in beautiful San Jose. You know that.
We love to hear it. So Michael, let me go ahead and introduce you. Let me read your formal bio and then we'll get into the questions. But so anyone who hasn't had the pleasure of meeting Michael, Michael Lane is the State Policy Director at SPUR, which stands for the San Francisco Bay Area Planning and Urban Research Association, but you'll generally see him noted as SPUR. Michael has an extensive background in housing development, local government, public policy, legislation, politics, and campaigns. Prior to joining SPUR, Michael worked at SV at Home, the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, or NPH, and Self-Help Enterprises, the oldest and largest nonprofit developer of affordable self-help housing in the nation. Michael served as president of the board of directors for the Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo, and was a member of the advisory committee for the state of California's 2014 Affordable Housing Cost Study. He has also served on the board of directors of Housing California and held elected office as a school board member and a city council member. So again, Michael, welcome. Launching right into it. First question for you. You're one of the few people in housing policy that seems to have a legitimate fan club. Like there are adult serious advocates that whenever your name comes up, say, good guy, really good guy. And I count myself as a member. So how do you feel about having a legitimate fan club, Michael?
Well, I'm really grateful to have so many wonderful friends in this space. And as you know, to be a houser means you're persistent, and you never give up. And we just got a great group of people to work with. So it's really a privilege. And believe me, the admiration, the love is mutual for sure.
See, that's why you got a fan club. That was a great answer. So moving on to our serious questions. Tell us about SPUR and the work you do there.
Yeah, so SPUR is over 100 years old, public policy think tank, and as you know, with particular presence and a focus in San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose, but also a regional type of a series of policies that we bring, for example, and engage with MTC and ABAG, because as you know, at the regional level, there's lots of important work that's happening as well. And then more recently, we've taken a lot of that policy work that's generated in our cities, in our region, to Sacramento, because oftentimes we do need state interventions as well to be able to implement the policies that we like to see, and to really to solve some of our larger problems. It really does that state emphasis as well. So I'm particularly focused on housing, as you mentioned. My other colleagues will also work in Sacramento in transportation, climate change, clean energy, social and economic justice issues as well. And then more recently, over the past few years, we've built up an informal statewide coalition of the California Home Building Alliance of other organizations and lobbyists who are also working on pro-housing legislation in the state to try to support each other, as well as our authors and legislators who are really trying to solve our housing and homelessness crisis.
Absolutely. And you folks do amazing work. And I often, even because we intersect so often on housing issues, do forget sometimes the breadth of work of SPUR. So thank you, for all the great work that your work does. But maybe if you could tell us a little bit about what were your sponsored or priority bills this year, and maybe just kind of walk us through what was on deck for you all in terms of your focus.
Yeah, I thought I might just talk about some general themes instead of throwing bill numbers at folks, because what I also wanted to say is on our website, spur.org, we also have a blog post where you can come and dive into more detail about who the authors and co-sponsors are and what the bills do. But just as general themes, and this is for SPUR, but for our HBA, as I talked about, our informal coalition, it's really about reducing the time and cost it takes to build housing, and as a way to also drive affordability and availability of homes in our states. And so those will be some of the themes that you'll see us working on in terms of land use and policy, but also streamlining approvals, as Sosan had mentioned, and of course funding for affordable housing. So those are all very important, because as we always say, you have to have the land to be able to build the housing, you have to have the financing, then you have to have the political will to approve the housing. So that's typically the buckets that we work in at the state level. But one issue in particular we're really focused on are development impact fees and the way that can drive the cost of housing, because and it varies jurisdiction by jurisdiction, but some have very high development impact fees, and we certainly want development to pay its way. But we also need to understand that it can also be an exclusionary tool, because if fees are very high, that already determines ahead of time what kind of housing you can build in a community and who will be able to afford to live in the housing. And it can just make some projects, totally infeasible, particularly given other factors that we're facing with capital markets and availability of funding for affordable housing, et cetera. So we've started out with a bill that really is about development impact fee transparency. As I said, California has the highest construction costs, some of them in the world, but we also have the highest development impact fee costs in the nation in general. And so we really want to drill down on that. But the first thing is just to have the information so the developers know going in as soon as possible what all those fees are going to be, so that can be figured in when they're trying to do pro formas and figure out what the financing will be required to build housing. So we're asking jurisdictions, when you submit a preliminary application for your housing, to be able to, within 30 business days, to provide a good faith estimate of what those development impact fees will be. and special districts would be able to show what their fee schedules are and provide those immediately. And then once you've got your final approvals for your housing, within another 30 business days, to be able to provide a good faith estimate of that final total cost and sum total of what those fees are going to be. And trying to avoid surprises and be able to engage with jurisdictions earlier in the process to avoid litigation. As you know, there's a recent court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court on fees, and we expect there'll be additional focus in the future on this issue. But it's really one that we've got to get our hands around. Once again, we think that it's important that jurisdictions are able to address impacts of new development, but we also need to make sure that we're not creating infeasibility for housing development.
Absolutely. No, I think that's, one of the things I really admire about your work, Michael, is the way in which you tackle these very technical issues, because they do lead to the bigger picture social changes that we're looking for. But, if we could just go back to this development fee issue, just for anyone, if you want anyone to sort of take away a high level factoid from this webinar in terms of your work around development fees, what would be like the simplest way to connect the impact of development fees that are either inconsistent, hard to understand, or very high on overall affordability in a community, be it rental or for ownership?
Yeah, and our friends over at the Turner Center done a lot of work on this as well, and some of their recent studies showed it can be as much as nearly 20% of the cost per unit is in those fees. So it's really important that we know what those are, and that we try to control those to the extent possible. Obviously, all construction costs are spiraling out of control right now, and you have high interest rates, et cetera. So when you bring that all together, it's a reason why you don't see a lot of construction. Obviously, the real estate economics are cyclical, and we understand that. But obviously, these are additional cost factors that we can have some control over. And the first step is to know what they are, and then to be able to drill down on them and try to create more conformity and really identify those outliers who are using, in some cases, impact fees to impede new housing, which creates that scarcity that we have in the state.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So going over to another technical seeming issue, but that could have big impacts, especially on sort of the core wealth building issues that CCB focuses on. I know that there is a real shared passion and interest around condo development as one of the more naturally affordable ways to get into the home ownership market. So would love for you to kind of just give us a quick overview of what you were working on this year that we were supporting, and sort of why it fits into your overall strategy at SPUR.
Yeah, so we think we need a mix of housing types and opportunities, including rental and for sale. So it's a comprehensive approach, but affordable homeownership opportunities are really key, we think, particularly in the high cost coastal areas where it's really difficult to get into homeownership, if not impossible, particularly for those started out in the old days. We used to have what we call starter homes, for that first rung on that ladder of homeownership. And those just don't really exist for the most part in the most costly, parts of our state. And so we do know that for sale attached housing like condominiums can be to do that, to create that first step on the ownership. But we've also noticed that in California, we don't produce very many of those units. We produce about 3,000 condominiums a year. So we want to take a look at why we're producing so few, and then other states and provinces in Canada. So for example, Washington State and Hawaii, but also the provinces of British Columbia and Ontario, who are building like 10 times the condos and creating those for sale ownership opportunities. Why we're mostly just focused on rental housing in California. And so it's really trying to create on the supply side those additional affordable homeownership opportunities. And what we found is it has to do with potential litigation over defects that may arise over time with a 10-year statute of repose, as it were, a statute of limitations, in essence, when litigation can take place, which means that the insurance costs that go along with that are much more expensive than they would be for rental property, as one example. And then the ability to use deposits that are put forward while protecting consumers, but to be able to use those for finances, particularly in the overall financial, the capital stack that you're using, it can actually make a real difference. And if you can pre-sell your condominiums, you can also get more favorable terms from lenders if you can demonstrate that the project's going to go forward and you've already got a number of those units sold. And so that it creates a totally different dynamic. And we want to try to find that right balance between protecting consumers, of course, but then also being able to actually provide them with a product that we can't currently provide in California. So as Sosan had mentioned, we had a couple of bills. We weren't sponsoring them, but we provide technical assistance to Senator Glazer and his team. And so Shoshana was just fantastic in his office, and they really spent a lot of time working, with the consumer attorneys and other stakeholders to try to find a path. Ultimately, weren't successful this year, but we have to continue working on this issue because it's going to be so critical to be able to provide those homeownership opportunities, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of, again, close out on what I think can be technical sounding when we talk about defect liability, when we talk about, the use of deposits. But at the end of the day, it is, the work is really around getting more entry-level home ownership that working families can afford. So thank you, Michael, for your great work. I know you're coming back at the end. But next up, producer Savannah, if you could go ahead and bring our great colleague, Kelsey Lyles up. Hey,
Hello.
Kelsey, how you doing?
Doing well. Happy Friday. How are
Happy
you?
Friday. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So Kelsey, you are not only the Director of Health Equity and Repair at the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, or BARHI. You are also a California Community Builders board member. I got so nervous having a board member, my boss, on that I couldn't even say our organization's name. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and just read your quick formal bio, and then we'll get into it. So as I mentioned, Kelsey is the Director of Health Equity and Repair at BARHI. Kelsey's expertise in public policy, legislative advocacy, and integrating health and racial equity into systems change inspires her to promote innovative approaches to closing the racial health and wealth gaps for BIPOC families. At BARHI, Kelsey leads policy and advocacy efforts related to promoting prosperity for Black families through economic justice, structural change, and reparations. Prior to BARHI, she led health and racial equity policy initiatives at the Greenlining Institute, I can confirm that, the Public Health Institute, the California Strategic Growth Council, and the California Department of Public Health. Kelsey received her degree in sociology and community development from Howard University, and Kelsey's a board member at renowned wealth building nonprofit California Community Builders. I added that one in for you, Kelsey. I don't know if you want to put that on. Yeah.
No, thank you.
So Kelsey, first things first. As my board member and boss, how are you feeling about my bonus at the end of the year? I don't know if this is the right forum to talk about it. If it's better,
I think it's well deserved.
Okay, if this webinar goes well, then I'll ping you later. But so on to the serious questions. You are doing work that is a little different than some of the other folks that we've had on, in the sense that, home ownership and housing is not the core area of your work, although I know it is important to you. But would love for you to share with us a little bit about what you do at BARHI, what BARHI does, and yeah, overall what the mission is.
Yes, I am happy to. And I believe I have some slides.
Let me go ahead and get that started for you. Again,
I can go ahead and share that. Thank you for having me. BARHI, or the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, is a public health think tank. We started off as a coalition of 9 Bay Area public health departments and have evolved over the years to be more of a national facing health and racial justice institute, really focusing on the social determinants of health. One of our key focus areas is on Black health and wealth repair. One of our campaigns is especially focused on reparations. So I help facilitate a reparations coalition called California Organizations for Reparations, which we would invite folks to join. The vision is a California with reparative justice for thriving, healthy, and resilient Black communities. And folks really came together over a year ago, actually, once the California State Reparations Task Force issued their final report to the legislature to coalesce around a legislative agenda and advocacy that would bring that report to fruition at the state level. We can go to the next slide, please. And what brings us to the reparations conversation, many folks may already be familiar with the public health data that's very compelling around the preventable and unjust health and quality of life disparities that Black families face, particularly around life expectancy, generational poverty, and also housing insecurity. So just one statistic I wanted to ground us in and share on with respect to the housing conversation is that the California Reparations Task Force report found that about half of Black Californians live in a household where rent or mortgage payments are more than 30% of their income, and nearly 40% of Californians' unhoused people are also Black. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And then also, just quickly, I wanted to share a little bit more context about the growing momentum for reparations and racial repair throughout our country, even during these what feel like uncertain and very confusing times. So folks probably remember in 2020, there were a lot of robust and new commitments to supporting the movement for Black lives, for example. California actually made history by establishing the first state-level reparations task force in 2020. And simultaneously, around the same time, the state of California developed the Racial Equity Commission through the work of SB 17, which many of you may have been a part of. It's interesting to note that at the same time, there's been this groundswell of local government commitments to reparations. Many of these local governments are in California as well. So San Francisco, Sacramento, Culver City, Los Angeles, a lot of local governments are now studying reparations models and also creating their own programs. And Evanston, Illinois became the first government entity at all to actually pass and implement a reparations initiative, which was aimed at addressing housing discrimination. They actually were able to allocate about $25,000 to descendants of folks that were discriminated against due to redlining. And folks could use that money to go towards a down payment for a house or to make renovations to their homes. And now they've actually changed their program to make those funds unrestricted, which is very interesting. One challenge I'll note just quickly is that some folks are trying to now sue Evanston, Illinois for this very important program. So there's a lot of legal challenges that get wrapped up with reparations as well. Just note that. But there's still opportunities. We can go to the next slide, please, Adam. And within the context of state level legislation, which I know we'll get into in a moment, wanted to share this framework for reparations that is from the United Nations. Taking a step back to think about the global context in the movement for reparations and why it's important for government to really be involved, particularly since government has been part of perpetuating the harm. Government partners need to be part of the solution. And so comprehensive reparations should include not only acknowledgement of the harm and apology, which could be very symbolic, but also compensation to the community of eligibility that has been harmed, as well as systems change and policy that are ensuring that the harm will not happen again. I think I'll pause there for your next set of questions, Adam.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Kelsey. And I'll just share for anyone that's curious, I would remind everyone that for CCB, our mission is truly to close the racial wealth gap. We have chosen housing and home ownership as the primary tools based on our organizational history and our skill sets, but do want to remind everyone that we really value all of the efforts that are happening throughout the state and throughout the country to really address the racial discriminatory past that we have as a country. And so that's why we were so excited to have Kelsey on. And Kelsey, one of the things I'm really curious about is, obviously the main thrust of your work is not housing and home ownership, but do you tend to see any sort of like housing or home ownership component in the reparations legislation or conversations that you have?
Yes, I do. Thank you. We can go to the next slide where I will address so the California legislation this year was interesting. The Black Caucus has come up with a 3-year plan to introduce the state task force recommendations and roll out their support for them. So this first year, there was a full package, over 15 bills that were introduced, and our team did an analysis of them with input from a few partners. And we wanted to uplift particularly bills that helped create the infrastructure for government to support reparations, bills that would provide some type of tangible or material benefit to impacted people as a form of reparations, and also bills that had more of an upstream public health or like prevention focus. And these 3 bills in particular really resonated with us. All 3 of them are authored by Senator Bradford and recently passed the Senate Appropriations Committee. So hopefully they will be referred to the Assembly Judiciary Committee soon. And we are crafting letters of support if anyone wants to sign on, but they include an effort to create the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, which would be tasked with implementing all of the task force report recommendations at the state level, SB 1331, which is the Reparations and Reparative Justice Fund, and also SB 1050, which promotes restitution for racially motivated eminent domain due to unjust property taking. So folks may be familiar with like the Bruce's Beach example in Southern California. That one has some close ties to connections to land and home ownership. On the next slide, there's also two bills that we were specifically interested in related to housing justice and home ownership. These unfortunately died in the Senate Appropriations Committee. It was very sad. But these include property tax assistance to descendants of enslaved people in the U.S., as well as down payment assistance to support home ownership for descendants of enslaved people. We do want to continue to follow support for these bills and particularly work with partners and coalition members next year or in the future to bring them back to life. They are very important because I think the connection between housing justice and reparations is very strong. And we find that it tends to be a topic that folks in local government are hearing from their community members that people want to see as a form of reparations and reparative justice. But those were the two bills that really resonated with us that we wanted to see move forward this year, but unfortunately did not.
Well, unfortunately, that's been the theme with a lot of good bills, both CCBs, Unidos, SPUR. I think it has been a very tough one. But, as I mentioned earlier, I kind of feel like the good ideas are evergreen ideas. So we look forward to, really seeing this stuff come back. A couple questions for you before we let you go, Kelsey. First, you mentioned the case of Bruce's Beach. For folks that aren't familiar, what happened there?
And this is a story that people can also find online, because I don't know all of the details. But there was a property that historically belonged to a Black family in Southern California, and due to eminent domain, that family was removed from that property. It became state-owned property, and many years later, the family wanted justice for that. They wanted to have the rights to their property again. And so Senator Bradford actually was involved in helping the family be reacquainted with it. Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. And then maybe, Kelsey, I know that you had mentioned if folks are interested in learning more about your work, they can sign on to your bills or they can reach out for information. What's the website? Where should they head?
Our organization website is barhi.org. And they can also email me at klyles@barhi.org as well if they're interested in joining the coalition.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Kelsey. So I think, producer Savannah, we can go ahead and shift over to our group panel talk. And I would love to introduce my guy, my day one, Greg McGoffna, our Chief Strategy Officer, who's going to facilitate a panel discussion. Greg?
Yeah, thank you so much. You were talking about having your boss on. Now I'm asking my boss, who's going to answer questions in front of his boss.
Everybody's bosses is on today.
Yes. And as Adam said, this is, oh, what did you say, Michael?
The pressure's on.
Oh, yeah. And in working groups, Michael's my boss in other places. So as Adam said, this is a really great group. I came on because Adam facilitating this isn't on the hot seat, but now he's going to be. So Adam worked well with the panelists to ask or prepare questions, but they don't know what I'm going to ask them. So I know we've had some criticism in the past that there's a lot of jargon, maybe some of the concepts are too wonky and heady. So I'm just going to ask as from not like a normal person, but from someone who isn't just all in the housing policy. And since we're talking housing policy, I'm going to focus on that. And I'm going to start with my boss's boss, Kelsey and Esmeralda. So I think, Esme, Unidos is all over the US. You are here in California. Latinos are the largest ethnic group. Kelsey, African Americans, looking at the numbers from 1990 to 2020, the African American population has stayed rather stable. But that's in contrast to other ethnicities that have grown exponentially. So Esme and Kelsey, how are you seeing how are Latinos and African Americans doing in California as opposed to other states? Like thinking about home ownership numbers, thinking about you used an example, Kelsey, of what's going on in another state. So how are we comparing in California to other states? And I know it's a big question, so.
I can start because I actually know the answer because I looked into it. So the Latino home ownership rate is lower than the national average. So that tells you something, right? Also, like, we have one of the lower national home ownership rates also as well, just, you know, regardless of ethnicity or race. So that shows me, right, that there's extra challenges for Latinos. I believe it was about 3% lower than the national Latino homeownership rate. So although 3% doesn't seem like a lot, it's still significant when you think about like a state where we think that we have a lot of more progressive policy and that we're more inclusive, right? But the truth is not really measuring up in terms of homeownership.
Yeah, thank you. And Kelsey, I know your work is in California, but you have done some work nationally. Do you have any reflections on just the African American experience in California over the last few decades?
I think something I would add, and something that my colleagues are studying, would be the migration patterns of African American families in the state. Overall, we're seeing trends that people are, not surprisingly, looking for either opportunities for affordable first-time home ownership or more affordable rent. So they're moving from the coastal cities and areas further and further inland. And many folks are even leaving the state entirely in search for more affordable housing.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that has so many implications, just like on community investment, on environmental justice, who's commuting, what amenities people have, what opportunities to jobs. Yeah, so thank you. So I'm gonna hop over to Sosan and Michael. Sosan, you talked about in the state legislature, there's a huge deficit and we cut all this funding, but like, aren't developers making money and aren't there cranes everywhere? So why, can you talk a little bit about and Michael, you can add on to this. Why are we giving money to these luxury developers? And hint, I know the answer, we're not. But Sosan, if you could talk a little bit about that. And then Michael, maybe talk about just what we're doing on the state level, affordable versus not affordable, and why these small details matter. Like, why, if I keep seeing all these buildings going up, why does an impact fee matter?
Yeah, so you're right, Greg, we're not. So I guess, the answer there is pretty simple, but I think one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing is that the funding that's being cut is funding that goes to very key critical programs. For example, the Cal Home program, that's one that I think most folks on this call are familiar with, but maybe some of the participants aren't. It is one of the only, if not the only, state program that exists to fund the development of homeownership housing. And that goes to predominantly nonprofit organizations like Habitat for Humanity that are building homes for low and very low income individuals that qualify to become a homeowner. And that is funding that the governor has proposed to remove from the budget this year, which, I think it was around 125 million in one-time funds. And they had to fight tooth and nail to get that funding last year. And that could fund around 1,000 to 2,000 homes, increasing the homeownership rate for many low-income individuals in California. And so that's an example of one of the programs that we're seeing that's facing some significant cuts that has major implications. And I would say that that's true across the board, both across the spectrum of housing, from homelessness funding, the HAP funding, and across to Cal Home, right? So it really runs the spectrum right now. And I think that's the biggest challenge, is that we as a state say that housing and homelessness is a priority. Obviously, where we put our money is a reflection of what our priorities are. And we recognize, obviously, there are a lot of competing, requests and programs. But given the state of the homelessness and housing crisis in California, I think that is one of the biggest disappointments from folks that are working in this space, in that there's a real critical need for that funding that already exists, right? We're not even just talking about new programs, we're talking about existing money and programs. So I'll turn it over to Michael, because he can maybe add on a little bit more about some of the affordability components.
Yeah, so Michael, I guess, sorry, with a $58 billion deficit, we can't just build it all government. So why should we focus on these little things? And please continue the thought before I interrupted you.
Oh yeah, no problem. I was gonna say there actually aren't as many, cranes in the sky as there were, and we're actually grinding to a halt right now, unfortunately, and we'll see that as it plays out. And that's actually bad for our local workforce as well, of course, and the economy. And so that's a major challenge. But lots of headwinds in terms of, interest rates, cost of construction, capital markets, and the challenges of getting projects approved. In California, there are other states that are, obviously much more friendly to housing production. That creates a challenge. And then also we've got a pipeline of 100% affordable housing deals that are not going to go through if we don't put a statewide bond, on the ballot in November, for example, and BAFA's not able to move forward with their regional bonds. Well, those are really critical. In Los Angeles, they also have a bond that they're working on, and that sub is going to be really critical. Otherwise, that entire pipeline is at risk that we've got, and that's major investments that have already been made and teeing up that development. So we need to make sure that funding is available. And the wider point, though, is many of the developments that are streamlined, to the extent that they are market rate, also have an affordable component, inclusionary housing component. And in many of the streamlining bills, of course, there are also wage requirements along with that, for prevailing wages. And so it's a good deal for our entire community, and for the workers and the future residents of that housing. So that's why we really need to stay focused now, and even with the budget deficit, to Sosan's point, continue to make that a priority in terms of investments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. And Adam, I see your hands up, but I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
So thinking about your background, no one introduced you, your background in affordable housing financing for a while. Why don't you talk about, we're talking about we're going to have to pass these regional bonds, but is there a way perhaps that we could look at how we don't have to put money in, how we could do something? Why don't you talk about Unidos and CCB's proposal and the idea behind it to not just rely on traditional financing mechanisms?
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and say really quickly, and I think Esme kind of covered it already to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, we have a mature, robust system for financing affordable rental housing. We need more money. It could do a lot more. There's far too many people that need it for a lot of different reasons than there is there. But we have a program and we have a system. And I think at the state level, we spend about $500 million a year through the state level low-income housing tax credit program. And what we had proposed with Esmeralda and UnidosUS was looking at how we could create something similar and a large-scale sustainable financing mechanism for affordable homeownership. And unfortunately, it didn't make it out this year. We knew it would be a tough year because we were attaching some resources to do a study to create this structure. But at the end of the day, this is an idea and a project that we think whose time has come, and we're very excited to stick with it, in one way, shape, or form in the coming years.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I'm sorry we didn't get to sheets in the Q&A, but Adam, I will let you wrap this. It just went when you're hanging out with friends, it goes so quickly. So
it's tough. It's the cool kids thing.
Michael? I just want to say real quick, Sheets is in my wheelhouse. So if someone wants to email me, glad to follow up with you and love to talk about it. I actually got to go to the oral argument before the Supreme Court for the first time in my life. So for the Sheets case, it was a thrill. But mlane@spur.org, glad to follow up offline.
Well, find him on Twitter. I'm sure he tweeted about it. So Adam, please.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Gregg. If we could just close out, maybe if we just do a quick round robin, if folks are going to take away one thing about legislation this year, what should it be? One thing, and maybe we'll start with Michael. Michael, what's one thing you want folks to take away from the legislative process this year?
Yeah, I think to Sosan's point, it's been a tough year. That we haven't had the very, ambitious legislation for a variety of reasons. I think there is some fatigue because we kept coming back. Obviously it's an election year and there's a very volatile election year, of course, for all kinds of reasons, and this major deficit. And so those create a real difficulty, but that's when we need the advocacy even more, where it's even more important to make sure that our members don't forget that their constituents still need this issue to be addressed, even though there's lots of distractions out there and challenges that they're facing, and that's why we got to keep going and planning for that next, to Sosan's point, that next 2-year session where we can really bring out some new and big proposals.
Awesome, thank you, Michael. Kelsey, maybe we'll go to you next. What's one takeaway?
Yeah, I think I would echo that we should try to stay encouraged and remind ourselves that change can take time. This has been a very challenging year for a number of reasons, including the budget. However, this is the work that we are like meant to do. So I think we should feel encouraged and continue to fight on.
I love that. Thank you, Kelsey. Esmeralda, what's your one takeaway that you want to share with folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm just going to kind of repeat what people are saying to stay encouraged. And I think that we kind of maybe are a little, we're accustomed to getting policy wins. And I know as a national organization, I hear from my colleagues in other states that they're very envious of the fact that we can actually pass like policy so quickly and so much more easily than they can. So I think that really thinking about how we can continue to advocate and push electeds to do the things that we think are the right things, and really using those tools and not just solely focusing on legislation, but thinking about education and all the things that you can do in district still.
That's awesome. Great points. Sosan, you want to take us home? What's one takeaway folks should keep in mind?
Yeah, I would say, sort of given some of the challenges we faced this year, it would be one of my recommendations would be to find alignment with other organizations to the extent that you can, to partner with other either natural partners or not, right? Some maybe creative partners to try to elevate the work and amplify your voice next year, because we will anticipate being in a budget deficit again next year, just given what we're looking at. And so it will continue to be challenging, but if there's an opportunity to increase power in numbers, that would be a piece of advice I would give to folks.
I love it. So we're going to stick with it. We're going to work with everybody. We're going to have power in numbers. So again, thank you everybody for joining this webinar today. Thank you to our awesome panelists. Thanks to Greg for co-starring with me. Hope everybody has a great Friday. Go have a margarita.
Thank you.